90-year-old Evelyn Brooks never imagined her final battle would take place in a hospital gown. Denied medical care time, and again due to lack of insurance, this frail black grandmother had to use another woman's card just to be able to breathe. Handcuffed in front of strangers, tried as a criminal, she broke down in tears in court and whispered, "Please, don't look at the color of my skin. Save me." This story raises the question, when the law clashes with humanity, what truly matters? Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching today? And if you believe in committing a crime but not being a criminal, then this story is for you. Baltimore woke up under a slate-gray sky, the kind that pressed low over the city like a lid. A thin winter drizzle misted the sidewalks, turning streetlights into blurred halos and making the air taste of cold metal and wet concrete. Cars hissed past puddles. Somewhere a siren faded into the distance, ordinary sound in a city that never truly slept. Mercy General Hospital stood bright against the gloom, a glass and stone building that looked clean enough to promise mercy to anyone who reached its doors. Inside, the emergency entrance buzzed with fluorescent light, rolling gurneys, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the restless murmur of families clinging to hope. But that morning, at the very front of the crowded lobby, mercy was not what people saw. They saw cuffs. They saw a hospital gown. They saw a 90-year-old black woman with trembling hands held together by steel. Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn Brooks was 90, but the years did not sit on her like wisdom in a painting. They sat on her like weight. She was short, barely over 5 feet, with a body so slender it seemed she might be carried away by a strong wind. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, lined with gentle age marks that gathered around her mouth and eyes like careful handwriting. Her hair, once black and thick, was now silver gray, pulled into a neat low bun that had clearly been done out of habit rather than vanity. Her eyes were the first thing people noticed if they looked long enough. Dark brown, steady in the way of someone who had learned to survive by staying quiet. They did not plead. They observed. They endured. The gown she wore was the standard hospital kind. Thin, pale blue, tied awkwardly at the back, too big in the shoulders. It made her look even smaller. Her wrists, fragile and bony, were pinched together by handcuffs that seemed too heavy for the job. The metal bit into her skin each time she shivered. And she was shivering. Not only from the cold air that blew in each time the automatic doors opened, but from the way the room had turned into a display. Faces turned toward her like she was a warning sign. Evelyn's breathing came in cautious sips. Her chest rose and fell as if it had to negotiate with the air before accepting it. She kept her lips pressed together, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew words could become evidence. A security officer stood close behind her, one hand hovering near her elbow like she might collapse or run, though even the idea of Evelyn Brooks running was almost absurd. A nurse at the triage desk glanced up, then down, then up again. Her expression tightened into something between discomfort and impatience, the way people looked when they didn't want to see suffering unless it was properly categorized. A man in a puffy jacket whispered to his wife. A teenage girl stared openly. A small boy tugged his mother's sleeve and asked something she refused to answer. Evelyn kept her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her long ago. Don't give them the satisfaction of your shame. On the far wall, a television played a morning news segment at low volume. A cheerful anchor talked about a charity drive. Under the TV, a poster read, "Care for all. No one left behind." Evelyn stared at the poster and wondered if words could blush. Officer Sarah Donnelly. The woman holding Evelyn's paperwork was Officer Sarah Donnelly, 27, white, and built like she had grown up playing sports in every season. She stood average height, maybe 5'6", with a straight posture that suggested she was always bracing for a challenge. Her blonde hair was pulled tight into a low ponytail beneath her cap, not a strand out of place. Her face was clean and youthful, but her eyes, Sharp blue, quick to judge, made her look older than she was. Sarah's uniform fit perfectly, as if she wore the job like armor. A body camera sat on her chest, angled slightly downward. A radio crackled at her shoulder. Her jaw was set with the kind of certainty that came from believing rules were the same thing as justice. There was a reason for that. Sarah had joined the police force after her father, also an officer, was injured in a robbery when she was 17. People said she became serious overnight. Her mother called it determination. Her old friends called it cold. Sarah called it control. She believed control was the only thing that separated good people from chaos, and today, she believed she had control of this situation. Evelyn Brooks, Sarah said, reading the name carefully as if tasting it. You understand why you're being detained? Evelyn's voice came out soft, scratchy. I understand why you think I'm being detained. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, this isn't a debate. We have evidence of identity fraud. You presented insurance information that does not belong to you. Evelyn didn't lift her hands. She couldn't. But she lifted her gaze. I presented a way to see a doctor. A murmur rippled behind them, like the room was deciding whether to be shocked or entertained. Sarah's expression hardened. That's not how this works. Evelyn's chest tightened at the edge of those words. That's not how this works. She'd heard versions of them her entire life. At a bank, at a pharmacy, at a clinic, at a public office, sometimes spoken with politeness, sometimes with a smirk, always with finality. Her lungs pulled in air too shallowly. She could feel the familiar warning, a tightness like invisible hands wrapping around her ribs. A hospital administrator approached, weaving through the waiting crowd with the brisk stride of someone who feared inconvenience more than injustice. Dr. Calvin Hart, hospital administrator. Dr. Calvin Hart was in his mid-50s, tall and trim, with salt and pepper hair combed perfectly back and a pair of wireframe glasses that made him look more scholarly than he felt. He wore a navy suit instead of scrubs, an administrator's uniform, not a healer's. His smile was practiced, the kind that belonged in donor meetings and press photos. He didn't look at Evelyn's face first. He looked at the handcuffs. Then he looked at Sarah. Officer Donnelly, he said, voice low but firm. Let's keep this professional. We don't need a scene. Sarah gestured toward Evelyn as if presenting an exhibit. She created the scene, doctor. She committed fraud inside your hospital. Dr. Hart's lips tightened. We'll handle it appropriately, but I need to know, did she receive treatment under the false identity? Sarah held up a printed intake form. She did. The system logged it. The insurance was billed. Dr. Hart exhaled sharply, the sound of a man hearing the word liability in his head. This will require reporting. Documentation. Possibly. Evelyn interrupted quietly. Possibly what? Prison. Dr. Hart finally met her eyes. For a fraction of a second, something like uncertainty flickered across his face. Then it vanished behind policy. Ma'am, he said as if he were speaking to a difficult customer, there are procedures. Evelyn swallowed. Her throat felt tight. There were procedures when I came here without insurance, too. Your procedure was sending me away. The words landed heavier than she intended. She didn't mean to accuse, she meant to explain. But explanation and accusation sounded the same to people who didn't want to listen. Sarah stepped forward. You're not the victim here. Evelyn's breathing stumbled. The tightness grew. She tried to draw a full breath and couldn't. Her fingers curled weakly around the chain between her cuffs. Her eyes darted instinctively toward the triage desk. A nurse noticed, then hesitated. Nurse Elena Park. Nurse Elena Park was 34, Asian American, with tired eyes that had seen too many overnight shifts and too many patients treated like problems. She was slender, hair tucked into a bun beneath a cap, her scrubs wrinkled at the knees from constant movement. Elena was kind, but kindness in emergency medicine often lived behind a wall of exhaustion. She had learned to keep her emotions quiet to survive the job, but when she looked at Evelyn's face, something softened in her expression. "Elena," Dr. Hart called, not as a plea but as an order. "Make sure she's stable before she's transported. We don't need an incident." Sarah scoffed. "She's stable enough to steal someone's identity." Evelyn's shoulders trembled. Whether from cold or anger or fear, she couldn't tell. Her lungs begged for air. Elena approached with a blood pressure cuff. "Ma'am, I'm just going to check you quickly." Evelyn nodded faintly. Her lips parted. A wheeze slipped out. Elena's eyes sharpened with concern. "Do you have asthma?" Evelyn managed a whisper. Chronic. My inhaler, empty." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Convenient." Evelyn flinched, not because of the insult itself, but because it confirmed what she had always suspected. If she suffered at the wrong time, someone would call it strategy. Elena ignored Sarah. She looked at Evelyn's hands, the cuffs, the swelling. "Can we loosen these a bit? Her circulation?" Sarah snapped, "No. Not until she's booked. She's in custody." Dr. Hart lifted a hand. "Officer, if she deteriorates in our lobby, that becomes our problem." Sarah's gaze flickered, just briefly toward the watching crowd. Her cheeks reddened with irritation. She hated being told to adjust. Still, she signaled to the security officer. "Fine, but she stays restrained." The guard loosened the cuffs a fraction. It didn't help Evelyn breathe, but it helped her not feel like her bones were being crushed. Elena checked her pulse. It was fast, uneven. She looked up at Dr. Hart. She needs a nebulizer, now. Dr. Hart's instinct was to resist. Cost, protocol, optics. But Evelyn's breathing made the choice for him. It was no longer a debate about guilt. It was a medical emergency. "Get her to triage," he ordered. Sarah's mouth tightened. "She's not going anywhere without me." Elena guided Evelyn toward a wheelchair. Evelyn's feet shuffled, slippers slipping on the glossy floor. The crowd parted, some people stepping back as if asthma were contagious. Evelyn sat, her shoulders hunched, chest rising in panicked little jumps. The hallway lights were too bright, the noise too loud. And in her mind, a different sound played. The long, aching memory of doors closing. Across the city at the end of a night shift, a city bus rolled through wet streets, headlights cutting through drizzle. The driver's hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes looked tired in a way that belonged to someone who had been carrying worry for years. Marcus Brooks. Marcus Brooks was 52, black, tall, and solidly built with broad shoulders from years of work. His skin was medium dark brown, his face defined by a strong jawline and faint lines between his brows that never fully disappeared. He kept his hair short, black with gray at the temples, and wore a transit jacket that smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. Marcus wasn't a man who cried easily. Life had trained him to swallow emotions like medicine, quick, bitter, and necessary. He worked nights because the pay was better, because his mother needed medication, because the rent didn't care about dignity. Marcus had a gentle kind of patience with passengers, especially the elderly, but an edge appeared whenever someone spoke about people who don't want to work, or people who abuse the system. He had heard those phrases thrown like stones at folks who were already bleeding. He didn't know that, at this exact moment, his mother was being wheeled through a hospital corridor in handcuffs. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't check it. The route was still active. In a quieter neighborhood north of downtown, a woman stood in her living room holding a half-empty purse, her hands shaking. Not with age, but with panic. Margaret Collins. Margaret Collins was 78, white, with soft silver blonde hair cut neatly at her shoulders. She was average height, slightly rounded in the middle. the kind of body that suggested a life of home-cooked meals and long afternoons sitting with a book. Her eyes were hazel, usually warm, but now wide with fear. Margaret wasn't rich, but she had something Evelyn didn't: a stable retirement insurance plan from her late husband's union job. It wasn't luxury, it was safety, and now her safety felt stolen. She had been out earlier, grocery store, pharmacy, church donation bin, and somewhere between the errands, she'd lost her wallet. At first, she told herself it would turn up. Then she remembered the insurance card inside, and her stomach dropped. She dialed the customer service number, fingers clumsy. When the automated system asked if she was calling about recent activity on your account, she hesitated, then pressed 1. A beep. A pause. Then the line connected. Margaret's voice trembled. I think someone is using my insurance. Back at Mercy General, Evelyn's wheelchair paused at triage. Elena reached for a form. Dr. Hart spoke quietly into his phone. Sarah stood with arms crossed, watching as if expecting Evelyn to confess to something grand. Evelyn stared at the ceiling tiles. They were speckled, identical, endless, like the rules people hid behind. Her breathing tightened again. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come cleanly. Instead, a wheeze escaped. Then another. Elena's face sharpened with urgency. We're moving now. Sarah leaned in, her voice low, meant only for Evelyn. You should have thought about this before you broke the law. Evelyn's eyes flickered toward her. Not anger. Something older. Something tired. I thought, Evelyn whispered, about dying. Sarah blinked, momentarily thrown. Then she straightened, putting her certainty back on like a helmet. Elena pushed the wheelchair through double doors marked triage, authorized staff only. The crowd lost sight of Evelyn Brooks, but the hush she left behind lingered in the lobby like smoke. And outside, the drizzle kept falling, patient and indifferent as Baltimore carried on. Long before the handcuffs, before the lobby full of staring strangers and the tight chain biting into her wrists, there had been doors. Quiet doors. Automatic doors that opened for others and stayed politely closed for Evelyn Brooks. At 90 years old, illness was no longer an interruption in her life. It was the structure of it. Chronic asthma pressed against her lungs like an old enemy, who never fully retreated. Her heart worked slowly, stubbornly weakened by decades of strain. Diabetes lingered in her blood like a quiet thief, stealing strength in invisible increments. Every morning required calculation. Which pill first? How much water? How many steps before dizziness began? Survival was not dramatic, it was administrative. Evelyn lived in a narrow brick row house in West Baltimore, paint peeling along the window frames, the front stoop slightly cracked. The neighborhood carried the tired dignity of people who had learned to stretch what little they had. Inside, the house was neat, almost meticulously so. A crocheted blanket folded precisely on the armchair. A small framed photograph of her late husband, Thomas Brooks, who had once worked in a steel factory before layoffs turned his back into pain and his optimism into silence. He had died 15 years earlier, leaving Evelyn with memories and medical bills. The first time Mercy General Hospital turned her away had been 2 winters ago. She remembered the fluorescent lights and the polite smile of a billing coordinator who looked barely 25. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, petite, pale, with long auburn hair worn straight over her shoulders. Rebecca had kind eyes but a rehearsed tone. She had grown up in a suburban Maryland household where structure was safety and policies were sacred. In college, she had studied healthcare administration because she believed efficiency could fix broken systems. What she had not anticipated was the quiet cruelty that sometimes hid inside efficiency. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Rebecca had said, fingers hovering over a keyboard. Without active insurance, the cost of emergency respiratory treatment would need to be paid up front. Evelyn had nodded slowly. And if I can't? Rebecca's expression had flickered. Then we can provide you with a list of community clinics. Community clinics with waiting lists. Community clinics without inhalers in stock. Community clinics that closed at 5. That was the first door. The second came 6 months later when Marcus tried to fix it. Marcus Brooks sat across from a county benefits officer in a gray office that smelled faintly of toner and burnt coffee. The officer, a middle-aged man named Harold Finch, wore a wrinkled dress shirt and glasses that slid down his nose every few minutes. He was not unkind, merely worn down by numbers. He spoke in statistics the way other men spoke in stories. Your income exceeds the eligibility threshold by $412 annually, Harold had said, tapping the file. It's not discretionary. The system calculates automatically. Marcus had leaned forward, hands clasped, shoulders tight beneath his transit jacket. $400? That's the difference between my mother breathing and not breathing. Harold adjusted his glasses. I understand, it feels unfair, but the guidelines— Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but edged with exhaustion. Guidelines don't wheeze at night. Harold had looked away then, not because he disagreed, but because he had no authority to agree. The denial letter was printed the next day. Evelyn never blamed Marcus. She saw how he worked, how his hands were permanently rough from steering wheels and winter air. But she noticed the extra lines around his mouth each time another letter arrived. By early spring, Evelyn began rationing her medication. 1 puff instead of 2. Skipping a dose if the day felt manageable. She kept the inhaler in her apron pocket like a talisman, shaking it occasionally to reassure herself there was still something inside. Then came the afternoon in the park. It was late September, warmer than it should have been, the trees along the small neighborhood park already surrendering a few yellow leaves. The air carried a dusty sweetness, and children's laughter drifted from a playground across the grass. Evelyn walked slowly along the paved path, one hand resting lightly against a wooden cane. She moved carefully, not because she was afraid of falling, but because she respected gravity now. A bench sat near the fountain, a simple metal structure with chipped green paint. On that bench, slightly tucked against the armrest, lay a leather wallet. It was soft brown, worn at the edges, not flashy. Evelyn paused. She looked around. A young couple sat nearby arguing softly. An elderly man fed pigeons. No one seemed to be searching frantically. She approached the bench and picked it up. It felt heavier than she expected. Inside were the usual things: a driver's license, a few folded bills, pharmacy receipts. The name on the license read Margaret Collins. The photograph showed a white woman in her late 70s, silver blonde hair, gentle features, eyes lined with age but alert. Evelyn hesitated before opening the plastic sleeve that held the insurance card. She did not know why she looked at it for so long. Perhaps because it represented something she had not held in years: certainty. She closed the wallet carefully and sat on the bench, resting it in her lap. She intended, truly, to find a way to return it. Maybe the address on the license. Maybe the church listed on a small donation card inside. But intention is fragile when measured against oxygen. That night the sky turned from amber to black, faster than she expected. Humidity thickened the air inside her house. She felt the warning in her chest before she fully understood it. A subtle tightening. A whistle in her breath. She reached into her apron pocket for the inhaler. She shook it once, twice. She pressed it to her lips and inhaled deeply. Nothing. No cool rush, no medicine, just the hollow click of an empty device. Her lungs panicked before her mind did. She tried again, the same hollow sound. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the wallet still resting there from earlier. Outside, a distant siren wailed. Inside, the ticking of the wall clock felt too loud. She stared at the wallet, then at the dark window, then back at the wallet. Margaret Collins, 78, insured, covered. Evelyn's chest tightened further. Her breaths became shallow pulls, like someone sipping air through a straw. She did not think about fraud. She thought about survival. "I have to save myself first," she whispered to the empty kitchen. Across the city, Margaret Collins was finishing her dinner, chicken soup and crackers, alone at a small dining table beneath a soft lamp. Margaret was a widow of 8 years. Her husband, Paul Collins, had worked for a municipal sanitation department, steady and proud. His union benefits provided Margaret with stable retirement insurance, not luxury, but security. Margaret was not wealthy. She budgeted carefully, clipped coupons, donated modestly to her church. She lived in a tidy townhouse with lace curtains and a cat named Oliver, a gray tabby of 12 years who moved slowly but watched everything. That evening, Margaret reached for her purse to double-check a pharmacy receipt. The purse felt lighter. She frowned and opened it fully. No wallet. Her breath caught. Not with illness, but with fear. "Oliver," she murmured, though the cat offered no solution. Margaret retraced her steps in her mind. Grocery store. Park bench near the fountain. Pharmacy. She had sat briefly in the park to rest her knees. She pressed her lips together and told herself someone decent would return it. She did not yet imagine that someone else was staring at her insurance card under a kitchen light across town. Meanwhile, Marcus arrived home after his shift, rain beginning to fall lightly against the windshield of his bus. He noticed the house lights were off earlier than usual. He knocked softly before unlocking the door. "Mom?" he called. No answer. He stepped inside, removing his jacket. The kitchen light was on, the wallet sat on the table. Marcus frowned. His mother was meticulous. She did not leave unfamiliar objects out casually. He picked up the wallet and opened it. Margaret Collins, insurance card. His stomach tightened. He knew the look his mother wore when she was choosing between dignity and necessity. And for the first time, he understood she might choose necessity. Back at the kitchen table earlier that night, Evelyn had made her decision slowly, not out of greed, not out of rebellion, but out of breathlessness. She placed Margaret's driver's license beside her own reflection in the dark window. 2 elderly women. 2 lives, 2 very different protections. Her hand trembled, not from guilt, but from lack of air. "Forgive me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom. She picked up her coat, and she carried the wallet with her. That was the moment the line between survival and crime blurred. And that was the beginning. The night Evelyn chose survival over certainty, the city lights of Baltimore shimmered through a thin veil of humidity. Mercy General Hospital glowed like a promise at the end of a dark street. Automatic doors opened with mechanical indifference as she stepped inside, her coat hanging loosely over her fragile shoulders. Margaret Collins' wallet pressed tightly in her trembling hands. The emergency lobby was crowded but orderly. A muted television hummed above rows of plastic chairs. A baby cried somewhere to the left. A man with a bandaged hand argued softly with his wife. The air smelled of disinfectant and impatience. Evelyn approached the registration desk. Her legs felt unsteady, not only from asthma but from the weight of what she was about to do. She had never stolen anything in her life. She had never even kept a coin that didn't belong to her. But tonight her lungs were shrinking, and morality seemed like a luxury reserved for the healthy. Behind the counter sat Tasha Green, a 31-year-old receptionist with smooth caramel skin and neatly braided hair pulled into a bun. She wore light makeup and gold hoop earrings that caught the fluorescent light each time she turned her head. Tasha was efficient, quick with a keyboard, and known among staff for multitasking better than anyone else. She had grown up in Baltimore herself, the eldest of 4 siblings, and had learned early how to juggle responsibilities. She prided herself on speed, moving patients through the intake system like a well-oiled machine. At that moment, however, She was balancing her hospital headset on one shoulder while speaking into her cell phone, whispering sharply to someone about picking up her son from basketball practice. Evelyn placed the insurance card on the counter. Her hand shook so noticeably that the plastic tapped against the desk. Tasha glanced up briefly, eyes flicking over Evelyn's face without focus, then back to the card. "Margaret Collins?" she said absently, still half-turned toward her phone conversation. Evelyn nodded once. The movement made her dizzy. "Date of birth?" Evelyn swallowed. She had memorized it. "June 12th, 1946. Tasha typed quickly, fingers flying over keys. She did not compare the birth year to the deep lines etched across Evelyn's face. She did not scan for subtle inconsistencies. The system prompted her for insurance validation. She clicked. Processing. Approved. The screen flashed green. Tasha barely looked up. "Have a seat. Someone will call you." She handed back the card without a second glance. No alarms rang, no questions followed. The system accepted her. Evelyn lowered herself into a chair, her breathing shallow but steady enough to hold. The approval felt unreal, like stepping through a door she had long believed locked. She watched the sliding doors open and close, watched other patients move through triage, watched the world operate normally. Minutes later, a nurse called out, "Margaret Collins?" Evelyn stood slowly. Each step toward the examination hallway felt like crossing a fragile bridge. She was guided into a small room where oxygen tanks lined the wall. A respiratory therapist fitted a mask gently over her face. Cool air rushed into her lungs. For a moment, panic gave way to relief. It was the first full breath she had taken in months. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes closed. The tight iron band around her chest loosened. She had gambled and won. Down the hall, a young medical intern named Daniel Reed paused at a computer station. Daniel was 24, tall and lean with pale skin and sandy brown hair that refused to stay neatly combed. His glasses were slightly crooked from constantly pushing them up his nose. He had graduated near the top of his class and carried himself with the earnest intensity of someone who still believed medicine was sacred. Daniel noticed something small while reviewing intake files. The birth date on Margaret Collins's insurance card suggested a 78-year-old woman. The patient in exam room 3 appeared significantly older. He frowned slightly. He was not suspicious by nature, but he was meticulous. "Dr. Keller?" Daniel said quietly, turning toward his supervising physician. Dr. Martin Keller was in his late 40s, tall with a broad build and thinning dark hair. He wore his white coat loosely, sleeves rolled halfway up, revealing forearms marked with faint surgical scars. Keller had practiced emergency medicine for 20 years. His face showed competence and fatigue. He believed in efficiency above all. Over time, idealism had thinned into pragmatism. "What is it?" Keller asked, not looking up from his chart. "The patient in room 3, the age doesn't quite match the intake record," Daniel said carefully. Keller sighed. "Daniel, we treat symptoms, not birthdays." "I just thought—" "Don't complicate it," Keller interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "She's hypoxic. Focus on the lungs." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He told himself there were plausible explanations. Data entry errors happened. People aged differently. It wasn't his place to interrogate a sick, elderly woman. Still, something unsettled him. Back in the exam room, Evelyn felt the medication working through the nebulizer. Each inhale came easier than the last. Her heartbeat steadied. She realized she was crying, but quietly, almost privately. Not from guilt, from oxygen. A nurse checked her vitals again. "You're responding well," she said gently. Evelyn nodded behind the mask. She did not speak. Speech felt dangerous now. Across town, Marcus Brooks unlocked the front door of their row house. The house was darker than usual. His mother always left one lamp on for him. "Mom?" he called softly. Silence. He stepped inside. The kitchen light flickered faintly. On the table lay Margaret Collins' wallet, half open. Marcus approached slowly. His jaw tightened as he examined the contents. He understood immediately what this meant. His mother would never have kept something that wasn't hers, unless desperation had cornered her. His chest tightened in a different way. Not asthma, fear. He looked at the clock. Late. Too late for a casual walk. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed her number. It rang in the kitchen drawer, where she kept an old flip phone she rarely used. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he grabbed his jacket again. Back at Mercy General, Daniel lingered outside Evelyn's room. He listened to her breathing, steady now, aided by oxygen. He watched as medication orders were logged into the system under Margaret Collins's insurance plan. The financial coverage ensured no hesitation in treatment, no debate, no delay. He wondered, briefly, what might have happened if that screen had flashed red instead of green. He didn't ask the question out loud. Evelyn removed the mask slowly when the therapist allowed it. She inhaled deeply without wheezing. It felt miraculous, fragile, but real. She looked at the ceiling tiles again, this time not as barriers but as something she might live long enough to see tomorrow. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself hope. She did not yet know how thin that hope was, but for now, the gamble had bought her breath. And breath was everything. Morning arrived pale and cold. Sunlight filtered thinly through the tall hospital windows of Mercy General. The overnight humidity had lifted, replaced by a sharp, brittle chill that clung to Baltimore's streets. Inside the hospital, the early shift moved with mechanical rhythm. Monitors beeping, carts rolling, coffee brewing in staff lounges. Evelyn Brooks sat on the edge of her hospital bed in a small recovery room, the pale blue gown still hanging loosely from her narrow shoulders. The oxygen had steadied her through the night. Her breathing, while fragile, no longer clawed at her throat. A plastic identification band circled her wrist. Margaret Collins' name printed clearly in black letters. She stared at it longer than she meant to. Her room was modest. Off-white walls, a single window overlooking a parking structure, the distant hum of traffic drifting faintly upward. A folded stack of her clothes lay on a chair beside the bed. She moved slowly, carefully as if sudden motions might summon consequences. She slid her feet into worn slippers and reached into the pocket of the hospital gown to retrieve the wallet she had kept hidden there. But, as she stood, the fabric shifted. The wallet slipped free. It struck the tile floor with a soft, unmistakable sound. The leather opened slightly on impact, spilling its contents: driver's license, insurance card, pharmacy receipts, across the sterile white tiles. Evelyn froze. For a split second, the world narrowed to the rectangle of plastic face-up on the ground. Margaret Collins. The door opened at that exact moment. Nurse Elena Park stepped inside carrying a clipboard. Her dark hair was tucked neatly into a bun, her expression alert but calm. She paused when she saw the wallet on the floor. Her eyes flicked from the license photo to Evelyn's face. Silence thickened. "Elena," Evelyn began, her voice thin. Elena bent slowly, picking up the card. Her movements were deliberate, careful. She compared the photograph, silver blonde hair, soft hazel eyes, to the woman standing before her. They did not match. Elena's shoulders stiffened. "I'll need to notify administration," she said quietly, not accusatory, not sympathetic. Professional. At that same moment, miles away in her tidy townhouse, Margaret Collins' phone vibrated sharply on her kitchen counter. She was seated at the table, Oliver the gray tabby curled beside her teacup. Margaret had barely slept. She had replayed the previous day over and over in her mind. The notification banner lit the screen. "Alert!" Insurance activity detected at Mercy General Hospital. Margaret's breath hitched. She pressed the message open with trembling fingers. The timestamp confirmed it. Services had been billed overnight. Her heart pounded not from anger, but confusion. She dialed the insurance company immediately. After navigating the automated prompts, she was connected to a fraud specialist named Kevin Patel. Kevin was in his early 30s, Indian American, lean, with neatly trimmed facial hair and sharp brown eyes that reflected constant alertness. He wore a headset and spoke with the measured clarity of someone trained to handle panic without absorbing it. His job required vigilance. Fraud cases were routine, but each one carried financial and legal weight. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "we're flagging the activity now. We'll notify the hospital and local authorities to investigate." Margaret hesitated. I don't want anyone harmed. I don't understand." "We'll handle it appropriately," Kevin assured her, fingers already typing. An automated alert shot through the system to Mercy General's billing department. Back at the hospital doctor, Calvin Hart stood in his glass-walled administrative office reviewing early reports when his screen flashed red with the insurance notification. His jaw tightened. Fraud investigation. His mind immediately shifted to liability, audits, public image. He pressed a call button. "Security to Recovery Room 3, now." Officer Sarah Donnelly arrived within minutes. Her posture was rigid, uniform pressed sharp, eyes clear and focused. She had been stationed overnight after filing preliminary paperwork related to identity discrepancy concerns noted by billing staff early that morning. Sarah stepped into the recovery room with controlled authority. She saw the wallet in Elena's hands and the name on the ID. Her expression hardened. "You knew," she said flatly to Evelyn. Evelyn did not deny it. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. "I needed air," she whispered. Sarah's jaw tightened. The words did not move her. "You committed insurance fraud and impersonation. That's a felony." Elena shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Security officers entered, 2 men in Navy uniforms. One was Thomas Blake, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a shaved head and a habit of avoiding eye contact during uncomfortable moments. He believed in doing his job cleanly and quickly. The other, younger and thinner, watched with nervous energy. "Ma'am," Thomas said quietly, "please place your hands in front of you." Evelyn stared at her own frail wrists. The cuffs clicked into place around skin that seemed too thin to bear metal. They did not allow her to change. The hospital gown remained. She was escorted through the hallway, slippers shuffling softly against tile. Nurses glanced up. Some looked away, others stared openly. The automatic doors opened into the main lobby. Morning visitors had begun to gather. Families with coffee cups, patients filling out forms, volunteers in red vests arranging brochures. They all saw her. A 90-year-old black woman in a hospital gown, hands bound in steel. Whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. Across town, Marcus Brooks had already been searching since dawn. He had driven past the park, checked nearby clinics, called neighbors. His anxiety sharpened into dread with each unanswered call. Finally, he steered his car toward Mercy General. The parking lot was crowded. He parked hastily, barely closing the door before striding toward the entrance. His tall frame moved with urgency, shoulders squared, eyes scanning faces. Marcus entered just as the lobby parted for the security officers escorting his mother. Time fractured. He saw the gown first, then the cuffs, then her face. "Mom!" he shouted, voice cracking. Evelyn turned slowly. When she saw him, something inside her broke. Not from guilt, but from knowing he would carry this memory. Marcus rushed forward, but Officer Donnelly stepped between them. "Sir, step back." "That's my mother." Marcus's voice was deep, resonant, filled with disbelief. "She's under arrest," Sarah replied evenly. "For what?" he demanded. "Identity fraud." Marcus looked at Evelyn. Her eyes met his. No denial, only apology. Security guided her forward again. The crowd parted. Phones were raised. Murmurs grew louder. Daniel Reed stood near the hallway entrance, frozen. He had watched the alert circulate among staff. He had seen the birth date mismatch earlier. He had suspected. He felt heat rise to his face. If he had spoken sooner, if he had pressed harder, would this humiliation have happened privately instead of publicly? But Daniel did nothing. He remained still, hands clenched at his sides, conscience heavy but silent. Evelyn was led through the revolving doors into the gray Baltimore morning. The chill air touched her bare legs. A patrol vehicle waited at the curb. Marcus stood in the hospital entrance, powerless. Inside, Dr. Hart issued statements to staff about policy compliance. Inside, the system corrected itself. Outside, a grandmother in a hospital gown sat in the back of a police car. The truth had hit the floor, and everyone had heard it. 2 days later, Baltimore's sky hung low and colorless above the district courthouse, a granite building that had witnessed decades of verdicts delivered in calm voices and received in broken silence. The air was dry and brittle, winter pressing closer. Inside courtroom 4B, fluorescent lights hummed faintly above polished wooden benches worn smooth by generations of waiting hands. Evelyn Brooks sat at the defense table still thinner than she had been a week earlier. She wore the same pale blue hospital gown beneath a borrowed gray cardigan that hung loosely from her shoulders. The cuffs had been removed, but faint red marks circled her wrists like quiet evidence. Her silver gray hair was pulled back carefully, as if neatness could restore dignity. She looked small in the high-backed chair, almost swallowed by the room's scale. Beside her sat Marcus Brooks, broad-shouldered and rigid, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. He wore a pressed dark shirt and jacket, though the collar sat unevenly as if dressed in haste. His jaw was tight, eyes red from lack of sleep. Marcus had always believed hard work kept disaster at bay. This room proved otherwise. Across the aisle, Margaret Collins sat quietly. She had chosen a navy wool coat and a simple pearl necklace, her silver blonde hair brushed neatly behind her ears. Margaret's posture was upright but uncertain, fingers folded carefully in her lap. Her expression held confusion more than anger. She had agreed to attend when contacted, told it was procedural. She had not expected to see a 90-year-old woman seated as a defendant. At the bench presided Judge Harold Whitman. 63 years old, tall and lean with thinning white hair combed precisely back. Whitman had a face carved by discipline. His pale blue eyes were steady, almost cold, and his posture rigid beneath the black judicial robe. He had served on the bench for nearly 20 years and had built a reputation for strict adherence to statutory language. Years earlier, his own father had lost a small business after fraudulent claims drained insurance resources. Whitman had spoken publicly about protecting systems from abuse. To him, rules were not suggestions. They were protection against collapse. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file before him. "The defendant," he began, voice even but firm, "is charged with identity fraud and insurance misrepresentation. These are not minor administrative oversights." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Leonard Grayson, stood to the right. Grayson was in his early 40s, compact in build, with sharp features and neatly trimmed dark hair. He spoke crisply, projecting clarity. He believed strongly in precedent. His tone carried no visible malice, only conviction. "Your Honor," Grayson said, "the evidence is straightforward. The defendant knowingly presented identification and insurance documentation that did not belong to her in order to obtain medical services." Evelyn lowered her gaze to the table. The wood grain blurred slightly as her breathing shifted. Marcus leaned forward. She needed help, he said, unable to remain silent. Judge Whitman raised a hand. Sir, you will speak only when recognized. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. Grayson continued. Intent does not dissolve illegality. The system relies on truthfulness to function. The words hung in the room like something sealed and final. No one mentioned that Mercy General had previously denied Evelyn treatment. No one discussed the denied benefits letter Marcus had received. Those documents were not in the court file. What was present were timestamps, billing codes, and scanned copies of Margaret Collins' insurance card. Judge Whitman turned his attention to Evelyn. Mrs. Brooks, he said, voice tightening slightly, did you knowingly use identification that did not belong to you? Evelyn's hands trembled faintly in her lap. She lifted her head slowly. Her dark brown eyes met his, not defiant, not pleading, simply tired. Yes, she answered softly. A faint murmur passed through the benches. Whitman's jaw set. This behavior is unlawful. Marcus inhaled sharply as if struck. Margaret shifted in her seat, her eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. The judge continued, tone sharpening. We cannot permit individuals to take matters into their own hands simply because they disagree with policy. That leads to chaos. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, not from shame but from memory. She had heard variations of that sentiment all her life. Chaos. Her breathing grew shallower. Marcus noticed first. He leaned closer. Mom? Evelyn tried to inhale fully, but the air caught halfway down. A thin wheeze slipped from her throat. Judge Whitman continued speaking, unaware for a moment. The law does not bend for personal hardship. Evelyn's hand moved to her chest. Her shoulders rose sharply. The wheeze deepened into a desperate pull for oxygen. Marcus stood abruptly. She can't breathe! A bailiff stepped forward. The courtroom shifted, murmurs rising. Judge Whitman paused mid-sentence, irritation flickering across his face before recognition dawned. Evelyn attempted to speak, but the words tangled. Her lungs constricted violently, the familiar suffocating grip returning stronger than before. Her vision narrowed at the edges. Margaret rose instinctively from her bench seat. She needs air, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. Evelyn's body swayed. She gripped the table, fingers white against wood. The wheezing grew louder, no longer subtle. Marcus reached for her, panic breaking through his restraint. Somebody help her! For a split second the room hesitated, not out of cruelty but confusion. Then Evelyn collapsed. Her frail body struck the floor with a sound that silenced everything. Marcus dropped beside her, tears breaking free despite himself. He cradled her head gently. Mom, please. Judge Whitman rose from the bench, robe shifting around him. His expression hardened, not in anger now, but in alarm. Call medical immediately, he ordered. A court officer rushed toward the door. Evelyn's chest convulsed. Each breath was a battle she was losing. Through the narrowing tunnel of consciousness, she managed to form words. Broken, fragile, but clear enough. Please, she gasped. Save me, don't. See my color. The sentence fractured on her lips. Her body went limp. Silence crushed the room. Marcus sobbed openly now, shoulders shaking. Years of restraint dissolved in seconds. Margaret stood frozen, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with something that looked like shame. Judge Whitman stared down from the bench, face drained of certainty. The law had spoken. But the human body had answered differently. The courtroom, moments ago rigid with order, now felt unbearably small. No one referenced statutes, no one cited precedent. All they saw was a 90-year-old woman motionless on the courthouse floor. The system had stood firm, and it had nearly watched her die. The courtroom remained suspended in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Papers lay half-shuffled on desks. A pen rolled slowly off the prosecution table and tapped softly against the floor. No one moved immediately. The authority of the room, the carved wooden seal behind the bench, the elevated chair, the rigid lines of order, had been interrupted by something far more fragile and far more urgent. Evelyn Brooks lay motionless on the polished floor, her thin frame swallowed by the dark expanse around her. Her chest struggled in uneven spasms, each attempted breath sounding like paper tearing. The pale hospital gown beneath her cardigan looked painfully out of place against the courtroom's heavy mahogany tones. Judge Harold Whitman stood frozen for a fraction of a second longer than he would later admit to himself. From the bench, defendants often looked distant. Files, charges, legal language attached to human shapes. But from where he stood now, looking down at a 90-year-old woman fighting for oxygen, the abstraction dissolved. She was not the defendant. She was a body failing. Her last words, "Don't see my color," echoed faintly in his mind, not as accusation, but as indictment. Whitman descended the steps from the bench, robe shifting around his tall, rigid frame. His pale face, usually controlled, carried a crack of uncertainty. For years he had believed that consistency was justice, that bending rules invited chaos, but no legal code prepared him for the sound of a human lung collapsing. "Call emergency medical services immediately," he ordered, voice no longer distant but urgent. A bailiff rushed toward the door. Marcus Brooks knelt beside his mother, large hands cradling her head gently as if afraid she might shatter. Tears ran openly down his face unchecked. His deep voice, usually measured and restrained, trembled with raw fear. "Mom, stay with me, please." Margaret Collins stepped forward cautiously. She had not intended to move, but her body acted before her thoughts caught up. Her hazel eyes, rimmed with moisture, were fixed on Evelyn, not with anger, but with something closer to regret. Margaret had lived a quiet life, rarely confronting anything louder than a neighborhood dispute. Her husband's union benefits had shielded her from many harsh edges of the healthcare system. Seeing Evelyn on the floor shifted something inside her, something she had not examined closely before. The paramedics arrived within minutes. One of them, a tall black woman in her early 30s named Jasmine Cole, moved with practiced efficiency. Jasmine's athletic build and steady posture suggested both strength and empathy. Her dark eyes scanned Evelyn quickly, assessing airway and pulse. She had joined emergency services after losing an aunt to untreated asthma years earlier, a memory that sharpened her urgency now. "She's hypoxic," Jasmine said firmly. "We need oxygen immediately." An oxygen mask was secured over Evelyn's face. The paramedic team worked swiftly, lifting her onto a stretcher with careful precision. The courtroom watched, powerless. Judge Whitman stepped back as the stretcher rolled past him. For the first time in years, he did not feel like the most powerful person in the room. He felt accountable. As the paramedics exited, the heavy courtroom doors swung closed behind them. The silence returned, but it was different now. Weighted. Whitman cleared his throat. "This hearing is suspended pending medical stabilization," he said, voice controlled but quieter than before. He looked toward Margaret Collins. "Mrs. Collins," he began cautiously, "you are the victim listed in this matter." Margaret hesitated. The word victim felt misplaced. She glanced toward Marcus, who remained standing near the doorway, staring at the space where his mother had just been. Margaret stepped toward him. Up close, Marcus appeared even larger, broad shoulders, strong build. But grief had reduced him. His eyes were red, his breathing uneven. Margaret spoke gently. "I don't want her in prison." Marcus blinked, stunned. "I want her alive," Margaret continued. "That's all." Her voice carried sincerity, not drama. She meant it. Marcus searched her face for accusation and found none. Across town, Mercy General Hospital's administrative offices buzzed with activity. Daniel Reed sat at a small desk in a staff conference room, laptop open before him. His sandy brown hair fell messily across his forehead, glasses slightly askew as usual. His hands hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. He had replayed the intake process repeatedly in his mind. The mismatch in birth dates, the unease he ignored. Daniel was young, but he was not careless. He believed medicine demanded honesty, even uncomfortable honesty. He opened a blank document titled Internal Review, Patient Intake and Prior Denial History. He began typing. He documented Evelyn Brooks's previous emergency visits, the denials due to lack of insurance, the billing notes, the timeline of repeated refusal of care. His supervisor, Dr. Keller, appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Daniel swallowed. "Documenting prior treatment denials, for transparency." Keller frowned. "This isn't the time to invite scrutiny." Daniel met his eyes, something he had not done before. "Maybe it is." Keller studied him for a long moment, but said nothing. He turned and left. Daniel continued typing. Meanwhile, local reporter Alicia Moreno stood outside the courthouse steps, microphone in hand. Alicia was in her late 30s, Latina, with shoulder-length dark curls and sharp, observant eyes. She had built her career covering community justice stories, especially those involving disparities in healthcare access. Her voice carried both warmth and firmness. When news of an elderly woman collapsing mid-trial reached the newsroom, Alicia volunteered immediately. An uninsured 90-year-old woman accused of insurance fraud collapsed during court proceedings this morning, she reported into the camera. Questions are now emerging about whether prior medical care was denied due to lack of coverage. Behind her, courthouse doors opened and closed. On social media, the story began circulating rapidly. The narrative shifted subtly, from fraud to survival. Back inside the courthouse hallway, Judge Whitman stood alone for a moment before returning to chambers. He removed his glasses slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The words echoed again. "Don't see my color." He had prided himself on impartiality, on blindness to race. But he now wondered whether blindness sometimes meant ignoring context rather than transcending it. He picked up the phone and dialed Mercy General directly. "This is Judge Whitman," he said evenly. "I want confirmation of Mrs. Brooks' condition and a full report of her prior treatment history." There was no anger in his tone now, only urgency. Outside, Margaret stood beside Marcus on the courthouse steps as the ambulance siren faded into the distance. "I never meant for this," she said quietly. Marcus nodded once. Neither did she. For a moment, two strangers, connected by a wallet and a system, stood united by something larger than paperwork. Above them, the gray Baltimore sky seemed less oppressive, not lighter, just honest. The awakening had begun, not in policy, not in law, but in recognition. Evelyn was no longer a case file. She was a life. And that realization had entered the room. When Evelyn Brooks opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was no longer speckled tile. Soft, recessed lights glowed warmly overhead. The room was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Sunlight filtered gently through wide windows draped with cream-colored curtains. The air smelled faintly of lavender instead of antiseptic. She blinked slowly, unsure whether she was dreaming. The hospital bed beneath her was larger, adjustable, with crisp white sheets tucked perfectly around her thin frame. A monitor hummed softly beside her, but the sound was subtle, not frantic. On a polished wooden side table sat a small vase of fresh lilies. This was not the crowded recovery ward she remembered. This was a private suite. Evelyn shifted slightly. The oxygen cannula rested comfortably beneath her nose. Her breathing, though fragile, flowed without resistance. For the first time in days, there was no urgency in her chest, A chair beside the bed creaked softly. Marcus Brooks leaned forward immediately when he saw her eyes open. His broad frame filled the upholstered visitor's chair, his transit jacket folded neatly across his lap. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but relief softened his face the moment she focused on him. "Mom," he whispered, voice low and steady, though emotion trembled beneath it. "You're awake." Marcus looked different now, not in appearance, but in posture. The constant defensive tension he carried seemed to have loosened slightly, replaced by cautious hope. Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat felt dry. He quickly lifted a small cup of water to her lips. "You're back at Mercy General," he said gently. "They moved you here." Her gaze wandered slowly around the room again. The privacy, the quiet, the dignity. Footsteps approached the doorway. Margaret Collins stepped inside hesitantly, holding her purse close to her side. She wore a soft gray sweater and carried herself with careful composure. Her silver blonde hair framed her face neatly, and her hazel eyes searched Evelyn's expression with concern rather than accusation. Margaret had not slept well since the courtroom. She had replayed Evelyn's collapse repeatedly in her mind. The image had followed her home, into her kitchen, into her bedroom, even as Oliver the gray tabby curled at her feet that night. She stepped closer to the bed. "I'm glad you're breathing easier," she said softly. Evelyn studied her face, this woman whose name she had borrowed, whose security she had touched without permission. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered. Margaret shook her head gently. "You were trying to live." Silence settled between them, not heavy, but human. A knock sounded at the open door. Judge Harold Whitman entered the room without his robe. Without the black garment that had once made him appear immovable, he seemed older, less imposing. He wore a simple navy suit, tie loosened slightly, white hair combed back but not as rigidly as before. His pale blue eyes no longer held sharp judgment. Instead, they carried something unfamiliar: reflection. He paused near the foot of the bed. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, voice calm and measured. "I came personally." Marcus instinctively stiffened, but Evelyn raised a weak hand slightly, signaling peace. Whitman clasped his hands before him. "I have served on the bench for 2 decades. I believed I understood justice." He looked directly at her now. "We were wrong." The words were not dramatic. They were deliberate. "Sometimes," he continued quietly, "saving a life matters more than enforcing a statute without context." Marcus watched him carefully, waiting for hesitation. There was none. "The charges against you are being dismissed," Whitman said, "effective immediately." The air in the room seemed to expand. Margaret exhaled softly, relief visible in her shoulders. Whitman continued, "Mercy General has agreed to establish an emergency care fund for uninsured senior patients. The board convened this morning." Evelyn blinked slowly. A hospital administrator stepped in behind him. Dr. Calvin Hart, his posture notably less rigid than before. He held a folder but did not open it immediately. Dr. Hart cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brooks, we failed you previously. That will not happen again." It was not a perfect apology, but it was a start. Daniel Reed entered next, hesitant but determined. His sandy hair remained unruly, glasses slightly crooked as always, but there was new steadiness in his posture. He carried a tablet under his arm. "I submitted a formal internal review," Daniel said carefully. "We're launching a policy audit to prevent intake bias and denial patterns for high-risk patients." Dr. Hart nodded in confirmation. Daniel looked at Evelyn directly. "It should have been questioned sooner." Evelyn regarded him kindly. "You're questioning now." Outside the room, hospital staff moved more quietly than usual. News reports had already begun circulating about the courtroom collapse and the sudden dismissal of charges. Alicia Moreno's segment aired that afternoon, highlighting not just the legal reversal, but the broader conversation about healthcare access. In Margaret's townhouse, her television remained on most of the day. She watched the coverage thoughtfully. Oliver, her aging gray tabby, stretched across the couch arm, unaware that his owner's life had shifted slightly. Margaret had made a decision that morning before coming to the hospital. She stepped closer to Evelyn's bedside now. "If you'll allow it," she said gently, "I'd like to visit you once a week. We can talk. Or not talk." Evelyn's lips curved faintly. "I would like that." Marcus looked between them, astonished by how something that began with fear had become something resembling connection. For years, Marcus had felt alone in fighting invisible battles, letters, bills, quiet refusals. He had grown used to bracing himself against systems that seemed immovable. Now, for the first time, he did not feel like the only one standing. Judge Whitman moved toward the door, but paused. "There are moments," he said quietly, "when the law must be interpreted through humanity." He did not wait for applause. He left simply, as a man reconsidering certainty. Dr. Hart followed, already discussing logistical planning for the new fund with Daniel in hushed tones. The room grew still again. Sunlight shifted across the polished floor. Marcus leaned closer to his mother. "You scared me," he admitted softly. Evelyn reached for his hand. Her skin was thin, but her grip was steady. "I scared myself," she replied. Margaret smiled gently, pulling a chair closer so the three of them formed a small circle within the larger room. Outside, Baltimore's sky was no longer gray. Pale blue broke through thin clouds, winter sunlight reflecting against the hospital windows. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly. The oxygen flowed easily. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something beyond survival. She felt seen. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at Marcus, then at Margaret. "Maybe," she whispered, voice barely louder than the soft hum of the monitor, "people can still learn to see each other with their hearts." Marcus smiled through tears he no longer tried to hide. Margaret squeezed Evelyn's hand gently. And in that quiet hospital room, once unreachable to her, the fight ended not with punishment, but with recognition. This story is not really about insurance cards or courtroom procedures. It is about the quiet spaces in our daily lives where we choose between judgment and compassion. Evelyn did not wake up one morning wanting to break the law. She woke up wanting to breathe. In our world, many people carry invisible battles just to survive the day. Some struggle with illness, some with poverty, some with systems that were never built with them in mind. When we see someone's mistake, we often see only the surface. We rarely see the fear behind it. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Rules are necessary, but humanity must guide how we apply them. Policies keep order, but compassion keeps us human. In our daily lives, we may not sit on a judge's bench or work in a hospital, but we all hold small positions of influence. We decide how to treat the elderly person in line ahead of us. We decide whether to assume the worst about someone who looks different. We decide whether to listen before we criticize. Education is not only about degrees or laws. It is about understanding context. It is about asking why before we condemn. It is about recognizing that fairness is not always sameness. True justice considers circumstance, dignity, and the value of life. This story also reminds us to examine systems, not just individuals. When someone is forced into desperation, we should ask what structures failed them. Blame is easy. Reflection is harder. Change requires courage from leaders, professionals, and ordinary citizens alike. If this story moved you, take a moment today to show kindness intentionally. Call someone who may feel alone. Support local programs that help seniors or uninsured families. Speak up when you see unfair treatment. Small actions build a more just society. Share this story with someone who believes in compassion over cruelty. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what lesson touched you most. If you believe that saving a life is greater than protecting pride, subscribe to the channel and be part of a community that values empathy and justice. May God bless you and your family. May He soften our hearts, guide our decisions, and protect those who are vulnerable. If you believe that love and mercy are stronger than prejudice, comment Amen and stand with us for a world that chooses humanity first. Evelyn Brooks, a 90-year-old Black American woman, very short and extremely slender with delicate, fragile features, deep brown skin marked by fine age lines, high cheekbones, silver gray hair secured in a neat low bun, dark brown tired eyes, wearing a pale blue hospital gown beneath a soft gray cardigan. Reaches out and takes Marcus Brooks' hand. Margaret Collins, a 78-year-old white American woman, average height with a slightly rounded build, fair skin with light age spots, soft hazel eyes, silver blonde shoulder-length hair neatly styled, wearing a modest navy sweater and pearl necklace, gently squeezes Evelyn Brooks' hand. Evelyn Brooks, a frail, elderly Black American woman with silver gray hair and a low bun, deep brown skin lined with age, dressed in a pale blue hospital gown and gray cardigan, closes her eyes briefly while resting her head against the pillow.